Hear now the word of the Lord from Psalm 131. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I've calmed and quieted myself. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I'm content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Friends of Jesus, there's something about Jesus' question that night around the table with his friends that I think kind of catches us in our tracks. Do you understand what I've done for you? Now, for many of us, I think it's kind of a natural question. I mean, we're here tonight precisely because we understand something about the significance of that night. There's something meaningful and important that happened in these holy days that calls us out of our normal routine to come here on a Thursday night, of all nights, and to bring ourselves in worship and in praise before God, to come around the Lord's table. But there's still something that seems a little bit unsettling maybe about that question of Jesus, because it's almost as if Jesus is fishing for something that he knows that we don't know. Or maybe he knows that we don't know. We don't know. Do you understand what I've done for you? I mean, in some ways the answer should have been obvious, right? To the first disciples, Jesus, well, of course, you washed our feet, Jesus. You're embodying that illustration of what God has done for his people in a very real way. You're living out that command that Israel said that they would live out many years before in the wilderness when they said all of the things that God asks of us we're going to do. That's what you are doing, Jesus. He, their master and teacher, had done a servant's job when they had been too busy to do so, and too busy because they were too busy arguing about which of them was the greatest, which of them should never have to do a job that Jesus just did. He had set an example, teaching them that for them too, the way to greatness was the way of service. Did they understand that? Well, maybe in this moment, probably more than they wanted to. And we too get that much. We can grasp the ways that we can be so busy chasing greatness, trying to do really important things and prove our value, that we forget who we are before one another and before God. We want to be masters and lords. We want to be in charge of our business and our captains of our sports teams. We want to get the recognition that we deserve from our spouse and from friends. We want to have a sense of our value and worth in God's sight and in others' sight because of all the good stuff that we're doing. And then we see Jesus put on a towel. And he starts to wash the feet of his friends one by one. And as we watch him go around the table, it gradually sinks in. He's working our way to us. We too, you and I, we need our feet washed. And so we understand, in a certain sense, maybe more than we'd like, our pride and our haste that keeps us from serving others. But is that really all there is to understand about this holy weekend? Do we really grasp the full extent of Jesus' love if all we see is a servant washing the feet of those around the table? Or do we really understand what we sang just a few moments ago? Would he devote his sacred head for sinners such as I? Some of you may know the older version of the song that the way that Isaac Watts wrote it, for such a worm as I. And we don't sing that anymore because in some ways it's just that we don't talk that way about ourselves, we don't think that way about ourselves, and it doesn't really make sense in our particular culture. But if you think about the picture that Watts is trying to paint with that song, we begin to understand the craziness of what God did, what Jesus did for us. Would we devote our lives for that of a worm? I don't think so. And yet the gap between us and Christ, the perfect Son of God, is even greater than that. We're used to seeing power and influence used as tools to get ahead. Even servanthood sells at times, right? An hurricane hits, an earthquake strikes, a train crashes, a factory closes, and our political leaders scramble all over each other to show up at the scene. It gets them votes. It wins them acclaim. How responsive, how sensitive they are. But not so with Jesus. The Son of God came to earth. He left heaven to mingle holiness with sinners, creator with creatureliness. And what did he get? Isaiah summarizes it for us well, I think. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we would desire him. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. God allowed himself to be despised and rejected by the very creatures he had made, all while giving himself for their redemption. And yes, in a certain sense, we are here tonight because we understand that. As people who have heard this story, who have tried to take it in, we get, on a certain level, that much of it. But in other ways, there's a lot about worship that we don't understand. I can imagine the journey to Jerusalem, like the journey to the cross, had a few moments where the pilgrim or the worshiper along the way, so we've tried to picture him going through these rocky roads of Palestine, suffering from the heat of the day, the threats of those who might jump out along the road to waylay unsuspecting travelers. As he thought about all of this, he said to himself, what am I doing anyhow? What's this journey all about? I don't really understand. Why go through all the effort, the stress, the hardship, the annoyance of this trip to Jerusalem? What's the point of a sacrifice? Another song of praise to God. Another day in the temple courts. Do these things really fix life? Do these things really help us figure out where God is in the moments that don't make sense? Does worship, does the journey to the cross really help us when marriages fall apart? When death and disease strike our loved ones? When we find ourselves on the receiving end of sins that we never asked to be a part of? What's the point, anyhow? The first time I heard Psalm 131 read in worship, at least that I remember, I was at the funeral of a 15-year-old boy. I was a seminary intern at the time. I'd only been in the area for about 3 weeks, so I didn't really know this family or the situation at all. But I did understand enough sitting there in the church that day to recognize that the pain in front of me was the result of this being someone's son, someone's grandson, someone's brother, someone's classmate. And the thing that struck me about Psalm 131 in that occasion was the way the why questions accompany human suffering would come alive in a moment like that. And I thought about how the words of this psalm expressed so well our inability to understand really what God is up to. And I think we all get that to some extent. We run into situations where we say, how can God be present here in this disappointment, in this hurt, in this confusion, when I don't know how to move forward from this place? And in a way, that's what Jesus does on Maundy Thursday, as he steps into our situation, our life, and says, do you understand what I'm doing? And at first, we nod our heads, yes, and we want to affirm that somehow, yes, we get it. We understand what this is all about. After all, we come from a theological tradition that prides itself on its intellect, its ability to grasp things like the incarnation and sacrifice and substitutionary atonement. But then we see the look on Jesus' face. And that question begins to sink in a little more, and we have to admit, as we look at the Savior with a towel around his waist, or as we think about what the next day will bring, what we on this side of the cross know that the next day brings, with his beaten and battered body hanging on the cross. that there's a lot of things that God is doing that we don't fully understand in the moment. There's a lot that we just don't get about this Passover that God has given us in the person of his Son. And so what this psalm does, and what this day does, what this weekend does, is it calls us to humility. David illustrates this attitude by pointing us to a weaned child. If you know anything about little kids, and a lot of you do, you know that weaning is a process. One author observes weaning is usually accompanied by resistance and struggle on the child's part, even hot tears, angry, accusing glances, and fierce temper tantrums. It's difficult for the mother. But weaning is necessary. The child is to mature. Weaning, in other words, is a messy process. But at the end of that process, we see a child who is able to sit contentedly with her mother, not because she's looking to mom to get something that she wants, but because she simply loves being in the mother's presence. And that, says David, is something like what happened between him and God. As human beings, we're prone to hot tears and angry, accusing glances and fierce temper tantrums along the way towards God. When it comes to the things God is trying to teach us along the journey of life, a lot of us have to admit that we run up against things that we don't like and we don't understand. And I think especially in the West, in the modern West, we are used to getting what we want. And so it's not surprising that we would start to believe that God's purpose in our lives is to make us happy and to fulfill our dreams, to give us what we want in life. But God's purpose in our life is not to fulfill our vision for who we are. God wants to be our God. He wants to restore us to himself. He wants to be the point of our journey. So that those psalms that we sang earlier, that we read earlier, about not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name be the glory, that those things are truly the desire of our hearts. And so he weans us from our dependence on the things of this world. He weans us, he humbles us, he quiets us so that we can do nothing more than rest in him and in his amazing love. Like Jesus' disciples, we're called to recognize our need to be washed by Jesus and then to serve others with his cleansing mercy in return. But what Jesus did for his followers that Thursday evening only foreshadowed the cross and its sacrifice the next day. Dirty feet need washing. Jesus' followers learned that on Thursday night. But the next day, what they would see is that sinful souls need purifying through the blood that would be shed on the cross. As we say in our baptismal liturgies, when we bring a child to this place, or an adult comes to be baptized, we tell one another that sin has made us so impure that we must undergo a cleansing that only God can accomplish. That's the point of the pilgrim's journey to worship, of the disciples' journey to the cross. The point is to lead us to the sacrifice, to realize that there are things that have to be done for us that we could never do for ourselves, because we do not have what it takes to offer to God the reconciliation that will bring us back to him. And that's something that's hard to get our minds around as human beings. We really don't fully understand how great God's mercy is for us. We can only accept that there's a truth in God's mercy into which we must all grow. And that's how this psalm ends. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forevermore. There's a quiet hopefulness and a hopeful quiet at the end of what David is experiencing, at the end as we approach the time to worship in Jerusalem. To the question, is worship worth it? Is it worth making it to the sacrifice? Or should we just stay home? The pilgrim is answering, yes, it's worth it. Even if it's worth it, it may be worth it in ways that I don't fully understand right now. I need this trip more than I'm aware. and that's why I'm going. And on Maundy Thursday, listening to Jesus' question for his disciples, do you understand? We can also understand, we can also admit our limited grasp of his cleansing work in some ways. And to acknowledge that we need his life-giving sacrifice far more than we ever realize. But there's also a call to hope in that. Because that acceptance of our own limited understanding, our own limited abilities, also means a commitment to grow. We keep trusting that God will reveal himself. Sometimes that God will reveal himself in the difficult situations that we wish had never come along. Just as God revealed himself in the betrayal and death of Jesus that Thursday night and Friday afternoon. And as we enter into that darkness of Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, God invites us to relinquish our pride and self-reliance. Acknowledge that God is a God worth trusting, and the journey toward him is a journey worth making. And Jesus asks us again, do you understand all of this? And we want to answer yes. But in humility we say, Lord, there's only a part of it that I get so far. But what I know of this night, what I know of tomorrow, is enough to keep me going toward the cross. Because in a world that's full of things that don't make sense, it's our hope in God's power and mercy and forgiveness that sustain us along the way. Let's pray.